Mayo, Michigan, a sportsman's paradise nestled in the vast wilderness of the upper Midwest.
It's an extremely rural area.
It's not real hard to live off the land up there.
But in 1985, a bizarre disappearance would put this tiny town in the crosshairs of a criminal investigation.
They don't find the car, they don't find guns, clothing.
They just fell off the face of the earth.
The quest for the truth would span 2 decades, and along the way, unearth a string of mysterious deaths.
You gather around the campfire and tell stories that aren't true. This one was true. Eventually, in a small town, a secret like this will get out.
Behind closed doors, beyond the headlines, every city has a dark side. March 5th, 1999, 8 a.m. Along a stretch of back road just west of Mayo, State Police Detective Bronco Lesneski is going door to door in an effort to interview local residents. In this quiet one-stoplight town, most police work centers on a few routine calls.
More the garden variety stuff is, larcenies and B&Es and things like that.
But Detective Lesneski isn't working your average case. He's investigating a crime that's baffled law enforcement and terrified folks in Mayo for years.
This case was a real Michigan mystery. 2 hunters went up north for a fun weekend and they never returned home.
Their weapons were never found, their billfolds, their bodies, nothing.
Operating off little more than a rumor, Lesneski is on the hunt for an eyewitness who may know what happened to the 2 missing men. When Detective Lesneski knocks on the door of a nondescript house at the edge of town, a woman cautiously cracks open the door.
I'm knocking on the door. I'm thinking, here I am, another strikeout.
Lesneski explains why he's here, but the woman refuses to let him in, though not before she tells Lesneski something that will forever alter the course of the investigation.
The woman says, you're going to get me killed. I think I found the person I was looking for. I think I found that person.
But who is this woman? And what is the terrible secret she's keeping? The answers to those questions would lay bare a crime so heinous, its details would be etched in the memory of an entire generation of Mayo residents.
It's something that the people will be talking about for a long time to come.
Buried deep in the Huron-Manistee National Forest, the town of Mayo is barely a pinprick on most maps. It's the kind of backwoods hamlet where a rusty old pickup or mud-soaked four-wheeler is the preferred mode of transportation, and where the pace of life moves as slowly as the crystal-clear waters of the nearby AuSable River.
It's a type of community, I think, that people, if they're not looking for the normal hustle and bustle of the city life, that this is what they're looking for.
In exchange for that leisurely pace, locals have to do without many of the creature comforts your average city slicker depends on.
You're not going to find a good bookstore. You're not going to find a movie theater. You're lucky to get the bowling alley in town, with a couple of lanes.
But what the town of Mayo lacks in modern trappings, it more than makes up for in breathtaking scenery.
The whole state up north is beautiful. It's woods, it's water.
For someone who likes to get out in the woods and enjoy the silence and listen to the birds, it's paradise.
A paradise that residents know how to make the most of, whether it's hunting deer, harvesting mushrooms, or fishing the AuSable's banks for trophy-sized trout. Mayo's hardy, self-sufficient citizens have been living off the land ever since the town took off as a logging camp back in the 1880s.
They're stocking up on salmon during salmon season. They're deer hunters. They know how to make venison sausage.
Not that everyone in town is some frontier survivalist skilled enough to make their own sausage. The region's beauty has also made it a vacation destination for urbanites in search of that authentic Northwoods experience.
A lot of people from southeastern Michigan have second homes and cottages there.
But just because these vacationers own homes here doesn't make them locals, at least not in the eyes of Mayo's year-round residents.
The city dwellers are called flatlanders or fudgies, and a fudgie is a local euphemism for yuppie, the people that drive BMWs and come up north to shop and buy fudge.
Thanks to the miles of jack pines and maple trees between most mailboxes, fudgies and locals are usually able to steer clear of one another, at least until the last 2 weeks of November, when Mayo is overrun with a different kind of visitor, the gun-carrying kind.
November 15th, sort of an undeclared holiday for a lot of people, because that's the beginning of firearm deer hunting season.
There are hundreds of thousands of folks out in the woods with guns. It's a time of year when you probably don't want to venture out birdwatching in the woods.
While locals use deer season as a chance to stock up on venison for the coming winter, many of the fudgies that flood the area end up shooting more liquor than they do deer.
Their biggest desire for many of us is going to the bars and dancing and just getting loaded and having a good time.
Make no mistake, the clogged highways and crowded bars can rub locals the wrong way, especially when out-of-town hunters set their sights on hooking up with members of the local female population.
There's a lot of grab-assing going on, and I think for the most part, it's probably harmless, but it can go south on you pretty quick.
The Oscoda County Sheriff usually manages to keep dust-ups between locals and flatlanders to a minimum. And with every deer season that draws to a close without a major incident, Mayo adds another notch in its belt as a destination for good hunting and good times. And back in 1985, two young sportsmen on the lookout for equal measures of both were 27-year-old David Tyll and his lifelong buddy, Brian Ognjan. Inseparable since Boy Scouts, David and Brian hailed from southern Michigan, but the pair often spent deer season in the Northwoods, where David's father owned a cabin.
It was specifically for the boys. It was like they just went up to have fun.
We mainly just played euchre, drank beer, ate chili, stayed up to the, Johnny Carson was over, went to bed.
After high school, David took a job as a machinist. Brian as a mechanic. Pretty soon, the childhood hunting trips took a back seat to real life.
Just blue-collar, nice guys, no great aspirations in life except go out on a Friday night and drink beer, watch the football game.
That and hang out with each other as much as possible. But between their home lives and 9-to-5s, getting together to shoot the bull was something that both men found increasingly harder to do.
You get into your 20s and you start having a full-time job and other responsibilities that you didn't have when you were 18, it's harder to get away.
But after a few years off, David thought it was high time he and Brian resumed their regular pilgrimage to the Tyll family cabin. So on the Friday before Thanksgiving, David and Brian tossed their guns and their gear into the back of David's Bronco and set off for the Northwoods.
They decided, kind of on the spur of the moment, to throw their guns in the car, throw their warm clothes in, and head up to have some fun.
The plan was to meet up with David's brother, who was already at the cabin. With any luck, they'd all drink a little beer, do a little hunting, and hopefully be back with venison for dinner on Sunday evening.
The sun's setting and you're halfway up north on a Friday night and you've got the whole weekend stretching out in front of you. It's a pretty good feeling.
We'll do some hunting, we'll do some drinking, see if we can pick up, a couple of girls.
But when Sunday rolled around, no one had seen hide or hair of David and Brian. At first, their loved ones figured the old pals might be having a little too much fun.
Maybe they had a bender and were slow getting out of Dodge.
You're always later leaving a weekend trip than you plan. You always get home later than you think.
But when Brian and David failed to show up for work back in Detroit that following Monday, their families knew something wasn't right.
These guys are faithful workers. They don't miss work.
The fear was something had happened to them. They'd gotten hurt. They'd crashed their truck in some back road.
Had Brian and David gotten in a wreck? Just as their families were wrapping their heads around that notion, they received a phone call, one that would lead them on a search deep into the Michigan wilderness, and ultimately lead Detective Bronco Lesneski to that nondescript house on the outskirts of Mile, on the trail of a pair of suspected killers. Every deer season, the tiny bars and no-name watering holes that dot the landscape of Michigan's northern hinterlands send more than a few hunters home from their weekend excursions a little later, and a little more hungover than expected.
Anytime you're near or north of the 45th parallel, drinking is a big deal in the wintertime. It's a major source of entertainment.
But when best friends David Tyll and Brian Ognjan didn't show up for work after a hunting trip, their families were pretty sure some late-night bender wasn't the reason they were no-shows.
He was such a hard worker that he wouldn't, not call and not go to work.
If a wicked hangover wasn't the cause of Brian and David's absence, then what was? Maybe they were stuck at the family cabin, held hostage by the unforgiving Michigan winter. It was certainly possible, at least until David Tyll's wife, Denise, spoke to his brother, Matt. Matt had just returned home from the Tyll family cabin, where he waited all weekend for David and Brian to show up. But according to Matt, they never did. Matt's revelation was enough to convince the Tyll and Ognjan families to file a pair of missing persons reports. But state police weren't ready to put out an APB for two missing deer hunters.
They were just thinking, oh God, these guys went off in the woods, they probably found a babe, or they just got drunk and hung over.
Police advised both families to be patient, but the Tylls weren't willing to wait. They loaded into a car and made the nearly 4-hour trek north to the cabin.
They start going into bars and restaurants. They made up a little flyer with photos.
We just went and tried to find something, somebody that would have seen them.
For days, the Tyll family trudged through the woods, searching for any sign of David or Brian. But the further they ventured into the Michigan wilderness, the more the mystery deepened.
1 tracks, 2 tracks, fire trails, dirt roads that get driven down once a month. It's real easy to get lost, and it's real easy to have something happen to you.
With the ground search going nowhere, the Tyll family decided to take to the air.
We rented an airplane to drive around and see if we could see his Bronco, parked in a field somewhere.
Roughly a week after David and Brian went missing, local and state authorities joined the search.
They dredged some ponds and overflew it with helicopters and eventually with ground-penetrating radar.
But despite the massive effort, the search turned up no sign of either David or Brian.
They almost vanished off the face of the earth.
By now, the two friends' disappearance was making news all across the state.
Every year, there's 2 or 3 or a handful of people who get killed in hunting accidents. It's a tragedy, but it's understandable. You don't have 2 guys just disappear.
There was one upshot to all the media attention. It generated the case's first credible leads. Surprisingly, none of them came from the immediate vicinity of the cabin, but rather from a small town known for its hunter-friendly bar scene.
They were, in fact, somewhere in Mayo.
But why Mayo instead of the Tyll family cabin?
You're saying the same jokes you said the last time you were together, and they decided they wanted to get in a little bit of trouble.
Investigators started talking to residents familiar with the local bar scene. According to multiple eyewitnesses, Brian and David had been spotted at a honky-tonk called Linker's Sky Ranch, where rumor has it, they were raising some serious hell.
By all accounts, were drunk and rude, and they did stand out, because at that point, they were making asses of themselves. At some point, got up, got in their car, and left.
It was the last part of the story that had investigators worried. For a pair of inebriated out-of-towners, the winding back roads of Mayo could be a death trap. According to another local couple who ran into David and Brian shortly after leaving the bar, both men were definitely intoxicated.
They were holding the map upside down, trying to read it, and that this couple gave them a little bit of insight as to where they might stay up in Mayo and gave them a little bit of sense of direction.
But there was another sighting of David Tyll's truck. On learning of the case, a local sheriff's deputy admitted to having seen a black Bronco swerving erratically on one of Mayo's back roads. But the deputy didn't pull the Bronco over.
It's near the end of his shift, and if he pulls the guy over, then he's gonna give him a field test, and then if he flunks the field test, then he's gotta take him to jail. So he just lets the careening Bronco continue on its way.
The deputy's sighting suggested that the pair had survived long enough to pull off a 3-day bender. It had state police convinced Brian and David weren't missing persons, but rather casualties of their own bad choices.
David and Brian were intoxicated and took a wrong turn and ended up in a lake or a quarry or a swamp.
With search teams scouring the nearby woods and rivers for signs of a wrecked Ford Bronco, locals were cooking up a few of their own half-baked theories about David and Brian's disappearance.
In every coffee shop and every bar, they were the topic of discussion. What happened to them? People speculated crazy things like, they were a closeted gay couple and they ran off to some tropical island, or, they were working for the CIA and they were actually undercover.
Maybe they walked off and a bear got him, or who knows what.
The swirl of speculation didn't deter David and Brian's families. Month after month, they made trips back to Mayo, armed with stacks of missing persons flyers.
Yep, definitely new flyers all the time, just trying to find something.
Around the time of hunting season, people would come up and put up signs. Have you seen these guys?
It was an undercurrent, and it was there all the time. And with the fervent wish that it would get solved.
Despite the family's near constant presence in town, and the fact that every Tom, Dick, and Ted Nugent in the state had a theory about what happened to these two hunters, folks in Mayo seemed hesitant to go on the record about David and Brian's disappearance. But by deer season of the following year, there was still no sign of Brian and David.
There's no bodies, there's no truck. What are you led to conclude?
It was a question not even the most seasoned law enforcement officers could answer. Over the next few years, several different agencies took a stab at the case, including a task force created specifically to solve these types of crimes.
There was a cold case task force that reopened it, looking at everything with a new set of eyes to see if they had missed something, but they led to no resolution.
Not knowing is the worst. It was really hard. It was horrible.
The legend grew every year. I think a lot of people in the woods kind of kept their eyes out for rusted truck parts. I do a lot of swimming and snorkeling in inland lakes in Michigan, and I always thought, maybe someday I'll go down looking for fish, and I'll see that Bronco down there.
As time marched on, clues about David and Brian's disappearance became even fewer and farther between. All their families could do at this point was pray for a miracle.
I always wished that someday the doorbell would ring and it was him at the front door. But most of the time they'd hear a lead or we'd see something on the TV about it, and sometimes I wouldn't even watch it.
Finally, in 1998, with the case as cold as a Michigan ice storm, it landed on the desk of State Police Detective Robert Bronco Lesneski.
I show up at my office and there's this case in a cardboard box, and the detective before me is briefing me on the facts and circumstances of the case.
Detective Lesneski's superiors didn't expect him to burn too much shoe leather on this beater of a case.
Bronco was in charge of 2,500 square miles. There was no time to spend it on a 13-year-old cold case that no one, including your bosses, expected you to do anything on.
Still, the veteran detective was intrigued. So on his own time and his own dime, Lesniewski began poring over old police reports and eyewitness accounts.
I had to get close to it. I was very desperate in terms of trying to figure out, getting myself in the victim's shoes, and what gave rise to that night.
A significant portion of the case file was devoted to two theories. The first one held that David and Brian had gotten drunk and run off the road. But no accidents had been reported that night, and no trace of David Tyll's vehicle had ever been found. The other theory held that the two men had decided to abandon their families and start new lives. But that theory held even less water.
For someone to just assume that they're sitting in Barbados on a beach with a cocktail in their hand, it probably would be a fleeting thought.
Eventually, Lesniewski stumbled upon another possible explanation for Brian and David's disappearance. That the two men might have been victims of a deadly bar brawl.
They were maybe a little bit too macho in what they were trying to do, and they got crosswise with the wrong people.
Apparently, when police had pressed locals for the names of who Brian and David might have gotten crosswise with, no one had an answer. Not even witnesses who saw the hunters stirring up trouble at Linker's Sky Ranch. Which made Detective Lesniewski wonder, did some Mayo residents know more than they were letting on? In the spring of 1999, Lesniewski headed to Mayo to follow up with a few of these eyewitnesses. Every one of them gave Bronco the same answer.
He was like, hey, listen, I'm scared to death, I got nothing to say. I have absolutely nothing to say.
And with good reason, apparently. In talking with locals, Lesniewski learned that one of the last people to allegedly go on the record about the case was a woman by the name of Eileen Siltz. After speaking with police, Eileen Siltz was found dead.
One of my witnesses said, I'm not talking, because that's what happens to you. That's what happens when you talk to law enforcement.
Had Eileen Siltz been murdered in order to keep the truth about David and Brian's disappearance under wraps? According to the original case file, Eileen Siltz had been strangled to death. Eileen's husband was originally the prime suspect in the case, although many Mayo residents were convinced there was more to her murder than a simple domestic dispute. But much like the search for David Tyll and Brian Ognjan, nobody was willing to come forward with additional information.
Certainly, it would leave a lot of people to believe that potentially one of the contributing factors to her death might have been the fact that she knew something about this case.
As he dug deeper into this new theory, Detective Lesniewski found himself asking a previously unthinkable question. Was the sleepy little town of Mayo the scene of a murder conspiracy? And if so, just how far were locals willing to go to cover up the crime? Between the local sportsman spinning yarns about big game and the camo-clad flatlander hanging on his every word, no one in Mayo can resist a good hunting story. But back in 1999, it wasn't tall tales of 10-point bucks or 5-pound trout that had Detective Bronco Lesniewski sniffing around Mayo's dive bars and hunting outposts. It was the decade-old disappearance of two out-of-towners, David Tyll and Brian Ognjan, and the rumor that the two men may have been murdered in a vicious bar brawl.
If it was someone I love, this is what we should be doing, and at least give the family some comfort in knowing that, hey, I haven't forgotten about you, and we're still here, and we're still working on the case.
In a town where locals would rather sit alone in a deer stand than rub elbows with outsiders, that was easier said than done. Add to that the suspicious death of Eileen Siltz, a woman who was found strangled to death after speaking to cops about the case. Detective Lesniewski was beginning to think the disappearance of David and Brian might be even bloodier and more convoluted than he'd first imagined.
It was kind of like trying to juggle the case to keep it going. You'd get this end picked up and that end would start to fall down again.
As it turned out, Eileen Siltz wasn't the only local who wound up dead after talking to the cops. Combing through the case files, Lesneski learned that another witness, Ronnie Emery, had been found dead outside another bar in town. Though both Silt's and Emery's murders had been investigated by local law enforcement, folks in Mayo seemed hesitant to discuss any connection these two deaths might have to David and Brian's disappearance. Detective Lesneski could certainly see why.
It was intimidating, and rightfully so. Who wouldn't feel intimidated?
As intimidating as they may have been, the trail of dead witnesses gave Lesneski a new angle from which to work the case. If he could tie Eileen Silt's and Ronnie Emery's deaths together in some concrete fashion, he'd be one step closer to figuring out what happened to David Tyll and Brian Ognjan. Pressing locals for any connection they might know of, Lesneski determined that Eileen Silt's and Ronnie Emery were allegedly regulars at Linker's Sky Ranch around the time Brian and David disappeared. And they were all acquaintances of the Duval brothers, JR and Coco. Though pig farmers and junkmen by trade, the Duval brothers were better known as Mayo's resident troublemakers.
There's really no better description of how the Duval clan existed at that time than comparing it to the movie Deliverance.
And according to the case file, a few years earlier, an anonymous tipster had contacted authorities and detailed a chilling conversation he'd overheard between Coco and JR.
There's a report about somebody in a bar overhearing these two characters talking about beating some guys.
But it was the next line of the tipster's statement that really piqued Lesneski's interest.
They started talking about killing these two hunters, how they killed them, they beat them to death, and they fed them to pigs.
To Detective Lesneski, the statement seemed too bizarre not to be true.
I guess you could call it police intuition, but who makes up a story like that?
Lesneski decided to pay the Duval brothers a visit. In the yard of Coco and JR's backwoods compound, he asked the brothers straight up, had they murdered Brian and David? After all, Coco and JR could have told the gruesome story to scare off any fudgies that might have been within earshot.
This may very well be one of the things the Duval brothers did just to embellish their reputation, to be the badder than bad, crazier than crazy guys.
They backed up real quick and said, we had nothing to do with this. We weren't there.
But Detective Lesneski wasn't taking any chances. If Coco and JR had fed David and Brian to their pigs, then there might still be some bone fragments or other physical evidence buried somewhere on the property. Lesneski secured a search warrant, and with the help of local officers and a team of cadaver dogs, set about scouring the Duval's property, pig pens and all.
Give me a fingernail, give me a body part, give me a vehicle part, give me a shred of physical evidence. You'll get your indictments.
But the detective and his team walked away empty-handed.
Their weapons were never found, their billfolds, their bodies, nothing.
It was at a dead end. There was not a shred of physical evidence.
Could the Duval brothers be telling the truth? Was their initial claim that they'd murdered Brian and David little more than a tall tale designed to scare off some flatlanders? In a town where a couple of shots of whiskey can magically transform a bad day of hunting into the day you bag that prize-winning buck, it wouldn't be the first time a pair of good old boys let their story spin out of control. And when Detective Lesneski pulled Coco and JR's criminal records, he discovered further evidence that perhaps the Duval brothers' bark was a little worse than their bite.
When they would drink, they would sometimes, get into fisticuffs. But there's nothing on this record that is more than that.
But if Mayo's most notorious hellraisers weren't behind the disappearance of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan, then who was? Just when it seemed the answer to that question was destined to remain a mystery, another witness would come forward and prove to be the key to solving the case, assuming Detective Lesneski could keep her alive. Trash heaps, illegal firearms. The occasional moonshine still. Even dead bodies. There's a lot you can hide in the endless wilderness that surrounds the town of Mayo. But time is the great spiller of secrets. And not even Mayo's towering walls of jack pines or the slow roar of the Au Sable River can keep the truth at bay forever. And despite a couple of deceased witnesses and a local populace too terrified to talk, Detective Branko Lesneski was determined to unlock the secrets surrounding the disappearance of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan.
Eventually, in a small town, a secret like this will get out.
Detective Lesneski's refusal to give up would eventually pay off. In March of 1999, he got wind of a rumor. A Mayo woman had apparently been overheard at a local bar, discussing her intimate knowledge of the case. The woman's name was Barbara Boudreau, Barb to her friends, and just about every bartender in town.
Barb Boudreau was one of the town drunks, had been a barmaid, familiar with every bar in the area, been kicked out of every bar in the area.
In a hard-drinking, yarn-spinning town like Mayo, police are reluctant to take the ramblings of a local barfly at face value. But given the short lifespan of some former witnesses, Detective Lesneski knew he needed to find Barb Boudreau, and fast. Barb's address and phone number weren't listed, so Detective Lesneski took to the streets in search of her.
I was like on a wild goose chase. As ridiculous as it sounds, you know, I just, when I got free time, I'd come up here and I'd just start knocking on doors.
On the morning of March 5th, the detective knocked on the door of a small house off Mapes Road. When a middle-aged woman opened the door, Lesneski asked if she knew anything about the missing hunters. Judging from the woman's response, she knew plenty.
Instead of saying, "I don't know, I can't help you," she says, "If I tell you what I know, they'll kill me too."
It appeared that Detective Lesneski had finally found Barb Boudreau. But what did Barb know? And who was she afraid of? They were questions Barb refused to answer, even after Branko jammed his foot in the door.
He said, "No, you can't come in. Just leave. Leave me alone. I don't know nothing."
Eventually, Branko relented and left, but not before making Barb a solemn promise.
When he said, "I'm going to solve this case," I knew he wasn't going to give up.
Over the next few months, Detective Lesneski paid Barb Boudreau several more visits. It didn't take long for his persistence and charm to start chipping away at Barb's icy demeanor.
He's there in the spring and he's there in the summer, and her mother's got a problem with her roof, and Branko's up of her mother's house fixing the roof, and he's helping her with her garden, and he becomes like Barb Boudreau's best friend.
Detective Lesneski's friendship with Barb would prove to be the key to breaking the case. One morning, as the two new friends shared a pot of coffee in Barb's kitchen, she finally decided to tell the detective what she knew about David and Brian's disappearance. According to Barb, she didn't know what happened to David and Brian firsthand, but she knew someone who did.
Barb staunchly maintained this was not something she had seen or knew from personal knowledge, but rather something she had been told by her friend.
At first, Barb refused to divulge her friend's identity, but she was positive that on the night in question, he'd seen David Tyll and Brian Ognjan beaten up by a group of men in the woods not far from Barb's house.
He had actually seen the beating that occurred in the clearing about a quarter of a mile down from the bar. He had come back to her house and told her what he witnessed.
Barb's statement was the most detailed account yet of what happened to Brian and David, but it prompted more questions than answers. For instance, who were the perpetrators, and what happened after the assault took place? Barb wouldn't answer these questions, but she did give Detective Lesneski the name of her friend, Ronnie Emery, which instantly rang a bell with the detective. Emery was one of the witnesses who died under dubious circumstances. Detective Lesneski felt two things needed to be done. One, make sure Barb Boudreau didn't meet the same fate as Ronnie Emery. And two, convince her to give an official statement as soon as possible.
People had lost their lives. If I lose one more witness, we're done.
But Barb Boudreau was still hesitant to fully cooperate. So, Detective Lesneski served her with an investigative subpoena.
We swear her in, we start the tape, we start doing some preliminary information, asking questions, and when she says, shut it off, shut the tape off, shut everything down.
I said, Bronco, you know I cannot tell the whole truth. You know I know. You know I saw them getting killed.
4 years after he took on the case, and 17 years after David Tyll and Brian Ognjan first disappeared, Detective Lesneski had finally found his eyewitness.
This is one of those incidents where it probably, it'll never happen again in my career, but I mean, I just about fell out of my chair. I mean, I had to catch my breath. I couldn't believe it.
The atmosphere was electric. All of a sudden, you went from having a rumor to having a case.
According to Barb, it all started at Linker's Sky Ranch, the night of Saturday, November 23, 1985. Like many of Linker's patrons, Barb and her friend Ronnie Emery had been doing some serious drinking. Barb was just polishing off her 9th beverage of the evening when two drunk deer hunters stumbled through the door. According to Barb, it was David Tyll and Brian Ognjan.
They're being a nuisance in the bar, and maybe a little obnoxious.
And it wasn't long before the two drunk fudgies had drawn the ire of every local in the bar.
I told Ronnie, there is going to be big trouble here tonight. And I said, I think we better leave.
According to Barb, after closing their tab, she and Ronnie headed back to her place for a nightcap. But just moments after walking through the door, Barb began hearing strange sounds in the woods outside.
She said it was this cries and pleads for help and this pinging sound.
Following the sounds through a thick patch of pine trees, Barb and Ronnie came upon several trucks in a clearing. The headlights revealed a circle of men, at least one of whom was holding a baseball bat. At the center of the circle, on their knees and begging for their lives, were David Tyll and Brian Ognjan.
David Tyll put his hands up in the air and he says, oh my God, will somebody please help us? And that's when he said, you're a dead MFer, and swung the bat and you just heard this crunching sound. And his head just disappeared.
Barb said that as David's headless body fell to the ground, Brian broke free and tried to escape.
I'm praying for him. Oh God, just get in the woods. Please get in the woods. But they dragged him back and he's fighting all the way. When they stood him up, they said, look at that. He peed himself. And I got sick. People will never understand that sound.
She tells me they're killing him. They're beating him to death. You know, they're killing him.
According to Barb, she and Ronnie Emery made a beeline back to her house, praying that the men didn't see them. But a few minutes later, there was a knock at the door.
They said, you didn't see nothing, you don't know nothing. She knew that. She better keep her mouth shut.
Detective Lesneski asked Barb if she could identify the men holding the bats. Finally, Barb choked out two names. Names Detective Lesneski was already familiar with: Coco and J.R. Duval.
I started crying, and it felt so good to get it out. It was like the weight of the world came off my shoulders.
With Barb's statement in tow, authorities wasted no time arresting the Duval brothers. On May 15, 2003, Coco and J.R. were charged with the murders of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan. When word got out that Coco and J.R. were behind bars, the reaction around Mayo was mixed.
A lot of people were relieved. Some weren't sure whether or not this was a case that was going to be able to be brought to justice.
You're looking at them and thinking, are these guys capable of something like this?
To some, the Duval brothers looked less like hardened killers and more like nursing home residents.
I was picturing fearsome-looking, kind of scary guys, and you see these little old men.
Adding to the mystery was the fact that at their pre-trial hearing, JR and Coco vehemently denied any involvement in the crime. The whole twisted affair had prosecutors sweating bullets. Arresting the Duval brothers for murder was one thing. Convicting them would be a whole different story. To find out more about the dark side of a city, go to investigationdiscovery.com. In the fall of 2003, nearly 2 decades after the disappearance of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan, local authorities had finally issued 4 murder indictments in the case. 2 apiece for Coco and J.R. Duval, the baddest badasses in all of Mayo. The news made headlines all across the Wolverine state.
Practically a quarter of a century after these guys disappeared, and we've got 2 suspects. It's the talk of the state.
On October 20th, amidst a packed courtroom, the state versus J.R. and Coco Duval began. In their opening statements, the defense pointed out that there was 0 physical evidence linking the brothers to the crime, a fact prosecutors had a hard time refuting.
This was one of the most challenging cases that I've ever handled. You had no bodies or no vehicle.
The only thing prosecutors did have was a witness, Barb Boudreau. On the witness stand, Barb told the court exactly what she saw in the woods the night Brian and David were killed.
Coco swung a bat and you just heard this crunching sound. It just cracked and his head just disappeared.
Prosecutors asked Barb to explain why she'd kept this information under wraps for nearly 2 decades. Her answer was simple. She didn't want to end up getting fed to the pigs like Brian and David. And on the night of the murder, Coco Duval made it pretty clear that's what would happen to Barb if she went to the cops.
Coco said, "You heard nothing, you saw nothing, pigs have to eat too." If you ever saw Coco's eyes, they're evil. They're just evil.
But when the defense got a crack at Barb on cross-examination, they gave the jury plenty of reasons to doubt her story. Specifically, the defense pointed to the boatload of booze Barb admitted to drinking the night David and Brian disappeared.
She admits to having 9, at least 9, at the bar when all this is supposedly going on.
Barb shot back that she could hold her booze just fine. Thank you very much.
Barb made sort of a wisecrack. Well, if you're asking if I was hugging the porcelain god that night, the answer is no.
The defense retorted by calling the jury's attention to sworn police statements from the staff at Linker's Sky Ranch, none of which placed the Duvals at the bar the night of the alleged crime.
The bar owner, the bar waitress, other people said they don't remember the Duval, and they knew the Duvals and they didn't see them in the bar.
Had the defense effectively discredited the state's only eyewitness?
The real crux of the case was going to be Barb Boudreau. Either believed her or you didn't.
Judging from Coco and JR's breezy demeanor in court, they certainly thought so.
They figured they're walking. You ain't got a body, you don't have venue, you don't have a cause of death.
On October 29th, 2003, the jury broke for deliberations. Just 2 hours later, they returned with a verdict.
The jury's verdict count 1 is guilty of first-degree premeditated murder.
For the murders of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan, the Duval brothers each received a pair of life sentences without the possibility of parole. After 18 years, David Tyll and Brian Ognjan's families finally had closure, albeit at a devastating price.
There wasn't really any high-fives or big celebrations about the verdict. It was just a sigh of just relief.
Looking back, I don't think I would want to know what happened after knowing. But I still don't understand it. I don't understand how people can be that evil.
As for the deaths of Eileen Siltz and Ronnie Emery, The Duval brothers were never officially charged in those cases. Formal charges or not, after living under a cloud of fear for nearly 2 decades, most folks in Mayo were ready for the Duval brothers to simply go away.
The image of the brawling out of control, deliverance-type brothers was not an image that Mayo wanted.
Although some locals didn't seem to mind the stereotype. The way they saw it, any image that kept the Flatlanders and Fudgies away couldn't be all that bad. Still, the camouflaged armies of downstate hunters still flocked to Mayo by the truckload every November. Though it's safe to say, whether they're huddled around a campfire or bellied up to a bar, the tragic story of David Tyll and Brian Ognjan is never far from their thoughts.
It is in their minds, and it should be in their minds, because anything can happen out there.